July 2025. Two men. Two death sentences. Two stories that ended on the same cold steel gurney inside Florida's death chamber. These were men who once laughed, loved, and lived, until their choices turned them into monsters. This month, Florida didn't just carry out 2 executions, it made history. A state that's now leading the nation in executions this year, and shows no signs of slowing down. But what crimes were so horrific they demanded the ultimate punishment? And did these men go to their deaths with remorse, or defiance? Tonight, we take you inside their final moments, their last meals, their chilling crimes, and the shocking reality of America's execution surge. You're watching Mr. Cold Case. If true crime stories with real details keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because this one is intense. The death chamber has been busy in 2025. By mid-year, more than 26 executions had already taken place across the United States, a pace the country hasn't seen in years. Lethal injections. Gas chambers. States moving faster than ever to carry out sentences that sat frozen for decades. And then came July. 2 more names were added to that growing list. 2 men, both from Florida, a state that's no stranger to the death penalty. In fact, Florida has now claimed the title as the execution capital of the U.S. this year. 9 executions in just 7 months. For comparison, some states haven't had one in decades. But who were these men? Let's start with the first execution of July, Michael Bernard Bell. His story begins in blood and revenge. Michael Bernard Bell, 54 years old. A man who wore calmness on the outside, but carried pure chaos within. By the time he walked into Florida's death chamber, he had spent more than 30 years waiting for this moment. His name is tied to one of the most violent vendettas in Florida's history, 5 murders, spanning 2 decades. It began in 1989. Bell believed a man named James Kirkland was involved in his brother's killing. The courts didn't matter to him. Patience wasn't in his dictionary. So he picked up a gun, tracked Kirkland down, and pulled the trigger. It wasn't justice, it was revenge. But here's where things turned darker. That first kill didn't satisfy him. It opened a door to rage that couldn't be shut. Prosecutors later said Bell had transformed from a grieving brother into a cold-blooded executioner. By 1993, Bell struck again, twice. 2 men, Ronald Howard and Alonzo Brown. Both murdered in cold blood. The motive? Prosecutors called it pure vigilantism gone wrong. Bell believed these men had disrespected him and his family. In his mind, every insult was a death sentence. By the time police finally cornered him, 5 people were dead. 5 lives erased. Investigators described him as a man on a personal warpath, convinced that the law could never deliver the justice he demanded. And that's why the state promised to deliver its own justice, the ultimate punishment, death. July 15, 2025. After decades of appeals, retrials, and last-minute petitions, the state of Florida finally carried out the sentence. The place? Florida State Prison in Stark, the same facility where some of the most notorious executions in U.S. history have taken place. At exactly 6 p.m., Michael Bernard Bell was escorted into the death chamber. He wore a plain white uniform, shackled at the wrists and ankles. Witnesses later described him as calm, almost unnervingly so, as if the fear had been drained from him years ago. The lethal injection protocol in Florida uses a series of 3 drugs, 1 to sedate, 1 to paralyze, and the final dose to stop the heart. At 6:10 p.m., the warden gave the order. The first chemical began to flow. Within seconds, Bell's eyes grew heavy. His chest rose and fell slowly, then stilled. The second drug locked his muscles in place. The third ended it. At 6:19 p.m., Michael Bernard Bell was pronounced dead. After more than 30 years on death row, the chapter was closed. Not with drama, but with sterile precision. When the warden asked if he had any final words, the room fell silent. Everyone expected a confession, maybe an apology. Something to explain why 5 people had to die. But Michael Bernard Bell didn't give them that. Instead, he turned his head slightly, looked toward the team preparing the injection, and spoke 2 words no one expected: "Thank you." That was it. No tearful goodbye. Just gratitude. Florida never released details about Michael Bernard Bell's last meal. Maybe he refused it, maybe it didn't matter anymore. For Bell, the real feast was freedom, the kind only death could give him. And on July 15, 2025, that's exactly what he got. But July wasn't done making headlines. Just 2 weeks later, Florida would execute another man, one whose crime was so brutal, so personal, that it shocked even hardened detectives. A husband. A father. A man who destroyed his own family with a crowbar, a rope, and a machete. His name was Edward Zakvsky. And his story is even darker. Edward Joseph Zakvsky II, 60 years old. A former U.S. Air Force mechanic turned family annihilator. By the time he entered Florida's death chamber, more than 3 decades had passed since the night he committed one of the most horrifying domestic murders in state history. Prosecutors called him a calculated killer with ice in his veins. On the surface, Edward was an ordinary man, husband, father, neighbor. But behind that mask was a storm brewing. His marriage was crumbling. His wife, Sylvia, wanted a divorce. For Edward, that wasn't an option. To him, if he couldn't have his family, no one could. June 9, 1994, Okaloosa County, Florida. The day Edward lost all sense of humanity. Investigators say the evening started quietly. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just a man walking into his home carrying a rage that had been simmering for months. He picked up a crowbar. One brutal strike crushed Sylvia's skull. Another swing, then another, ending her life in a pool of blood. But Edward wasn't finished. In another room were his 2 children, Eddie Jr., just 7, and Anna, only 5. They saw what happened. They begged. They cried. But their father wasn't listening. He tied them up with rope so they couldn't run. Then, in an act of cold-blooded savagery, he reached for a machete. He hacked them to death, his own son and daughter. The crime scene was so gruesome that even veteran detectives said it was one of the worst they had ever witnessed. In a single night, Edward wiped out his entire family. And then, he vanished. After the murders, Edward didn't stay to face what he'd done. He cleaned up just enough to buy himself time, then disappeared. His escape plan was simple: vanish thousands of miles away. Within days, he was on a flight to Hawaii, trying to start a new life as if the blood on his hands could be washed away by ocean waves. But freedom didn't last. Authorities tracked him down in Honolulu, living under the radar but leaving just enough trail to be found. He was arrested without a fight, flown back to Florida, and handed over to a court that wasted no time sealing his fate. In 1996, a jury sentenced Edward Zakvsky to death. And for 31 years, he sat on death row, appeals, motions, legal loopholes. He fought the inevitable for decades, but time never loses. On July 31, 2025, Florida cashed the check it wrote in that courtroom. July 31, 2025, Florida State Prison. The same cold chamber that ended Michael Bell's life 2 weeks earlier was prepared for another. At 6 p.m., Edward Zakvsky entered the room wearing prison whites, wrists and ankles bound in heavy shackles. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. His face carried no visible fear, just the weight of a man who had run out of time. Witnesses described the chamber as silent, tense. On the other side of the glass, journalists, officials, and a few selected witnesses sat frozen, waiting for the ritual to begin. The gurney stood in the center under harsh fluorescent lights, leather straps spread out like an invitation to the inevitable. Zakvsky lay down without resistance. The officers moved with practiced precision, strapping his arms, securing his legs, tightening the restraints until escape was impossible. 4 lines were inserted, taped neatly to his skin. Behind a curtain, the anonymous executioner waited for the signal. At 6:09 p.m., the warden gave the order. At 6:19 p.m., Edward Zakvsky was pronounced dead. Florida's 9th execution of the year, a grim milestone that placed the state at the top of the nation's execution list for 2025. Before the drugs flowed, the warden asked the question every condemned man hears: "Do you have any final words?" Zakvsky spoke clearly, his voice steady. "This is the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible." Imagine that. No apology, no confession. Florida officials never disclosed what Edward Zakvsky requested for his final meal, if he requested anything at all. For decades, every meal had been a countdown, every bite just another reminder of what was coming. At that point, what could food possibly satisfy? Not hunger. Not guilt. Nothing. So when the time came, Edward faced the end not with a feast, but with silence. And just like that, one of Florida's most monstrous cases closed its final chapter. Florida is now the epicenter of executions in America for 2025. 9 executions in 7 months, more than any other state. For supporters, this is justice long overdue. They argue these killers stole innocent lives and the state delivered the only fitting punishment. But critics see something different, a troubling shift toward hardline justice, with little focus on rehabilitation or prevention. They warn that this trend could lead to faster executions, fewer appeals, and less oversight. For them, the death chamber isn't a symbol of justice, it's a sign of a broken system. So here's the real question. Do these executions bring closure to grieving families? Or do they just add more death to the pile? For every gurney, for every needle, the debate rages on. And in states like Florida, it doesn't seem to be slowing down. What do you think about the death penalty? Does it deliver justice, or just more death? Should it stay, or be abolished forever? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this breakdown sent chills down your spine, hit that like button, subscribe to Mr. Cold Case, and share this video with someone who loves true crime stories. More shocking cases, more untold truths. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep questioning everything.